The workshop last week, for those who were here, was called Preparing for Tests. And some people don't do well on tests because they don't prepare right. So kind of address that issue. Today's workshop is test-taking skills. Next week is almost like part 2, if you want to call it that. And I just wanted to let you know what next week was going to be about. Sometimes when people look at these two names, it doesn't tell them very much. So this is the simple explanation. Today, I'm going to start with 3 general test strategies that would work for any test you have. And then I'm going to talk today about true-false tests and essay tests or any other kind of written test. Next week, at the More Test-Taking Skills workshop, I'm going to give 3 more general strategies, and then I'm going to talk almost all about multiple choice, since that's kind of the big, most common type of test question in college. So that's sort of the breakdown. And one other thing I want to say before we get into these right here is that it's impossible for me to do a perfect job of explaining to people how to be a great test taker. And the reason is because every class is different. Every test is different, every student is different, and so I can't address everything that you may struggle with sometimes on tests, but what I'm going to give you today are things that have helped a lot of students to do better on tests in the past, so I'm going to just kind of focus on those, okay? So first of all, we're going to spend about 15 minutes, 20 minutes or so on this. There are 3 things that I always suggest to students to help them do better on tests. And if you, by the way, I should say this too, if you don't study for the test, nothing I'm going to explain is going to help you. These are not miracles that I'm going to give you, like you don't have to study and you get A's. I'm not that good, and nobody is that good. You have to put in the effort, right? But here's the first one, and this surprises some people. I don't know why this is. This is a mystery to me, but a lot of students, when they find out that I teach study skills and how to be a better student, the first question they like to ask me, they kind of whisper and they say, "Can I ask you something?" And I say, "Oh, sure." And they say, "Could you tell me what's the smartest, best way that I could study on the morning of the test? What should I do?" And they're looking for, you know, like tricks and techniques or whatever. And I give them a really, I say, I know the answer to that. And what answer do you think I give them?
Review what you're studying for?
Nope. It's one word. And they don't like to hear it. We're talking about the morning of the test, okay? So this is what I tell them. Okay? Don't. And they look at me like, no, you must have misunderstood me. What should I do? And again, they're trying to get everything possible. Well, I'm going to explain this to you in a second, but the basic policy that I always try to encourage students to do is don't study on the morning of the test. There are a couple of exceptions to that I'm going to give you in a minute. But this is the basic rule. Okay, so in other words, when you go to sleep the night before a test, usually you should lie there thinking, it's done. I did all the studying, it's all up there, it's not going anywhere, and just let your mind rest for a while. Okay? The reason that I usually suggest this is that bad things tend to happen to most people when they study on the morning of the test leading up to 5 minutes before the test. If you haven't studied at all, go ahead and get up at 3 in the morning and start cramming. That's not going to work very well, but go ahead. But if you have studied, here's what happens, and I've had a lot of students tell me this. They get up on the morning of the test and they think, okay, I've already studied, but how about if I study just a little more? You know, it couldn't hurt. So while they're eating breakfast or something similar while they're waiting, they actually open up their textbook or go to their notes and start just skimming through everything they've already studied. And all of that sounds okay, except really often what will happen is that they'll look at something in their book or notes, something important, and they'll look at it and think, oh, that's right. That's right, I forgot all about that. And then the next thought they have is, what else did I forget? And they start panicking. They start kind of getting confused. Other people do something even worse. They're flipping through the book and they see something and they think, oh, I remember that. Oh, but that's not the way I remember it. In other words, I put it in there one way. That doesn't look right. Well, all of that tends to hurt your confidence, hurt your ability to do well on the test. And so that's not a good thing to happen on the morning of the test. Now, there are two exceptions to this. The first one is a good one, and this may apply to some of you in here. If you have a test that day, but it's not until late in the day, like 3 or 4 in the afternoon, 7 at night, something like that, it's not a bad idea for you when you get up to at least do a little bit of light review. Not cramming, not studying or anything, but just a little review. Because if you get up at 7 or 8 in the morning and your test is at 7 at night, that's a lot of hours to pass without thinking about it at all. So it wouldn't be bad to just kind of loosen up your brain a little. But if your test is at 8 in the morning or 9, 10, 11, noon or whatever, in the first few hours after you get up, it's better to just let good enough alone and just leave it alone and then move on from there. The other exception is a bad one. So if this ever happens to you, your time management was terrible in leading up to a test. And that is, if you go to bed the night before a test and you haven't finished all your reading yet, go ahead and get up and start reading the next morning. So for example, if you have a test on chapter 5 and 6 and 7, and when you go to bed the night before the test, you've read all of 5, half of 6, you haven't even looked at chapter 7 yet, you're in big trouble anyway, but you might as well get up and start reading. It's better than nothing. But again, this is something that you would want to avoid at all costs. So this is the first strategy, first general strategy. And then the second one, I want you to help me with this a little bit. It involves 2 words. Okay, first one is the most obvious one. You can't take a test if you don't arrive.
Really?
But when?
Early.
Yeah, early. And if there's ever a time as a student that you're going to arrive early at the classroom, it's on the day of a test. It's the smartest thing. And so I wanted to ask you this, because I'm always interested in people's ideas. Before I give you mine, if you could set up your schedule perfectly, how early do you think would be perfect to arrive at the classroom on the day of a test? 15 minutes?
10 minutes.
10 minutes? Any other?
30 minutes.
30 minutes? Sometimes when I ask people, the amount keeps growing. Okay, and so I wanted to tell you before I put this up here that a lot of students have told me they like to get to a classroom 45 minutes, an hour, something like that before the test. Now, if there's no other class in the room before yours, that means you can go in like an hour early and you have sort of the room to yourself. Well, if somebody shows up that early, what are they likely going to do while they're waiting for the test?
Panic.
They're going to panic and they're going to study, because it's right in front of them. And here's what happens. Kind of imagine that the clock is in front somewhere here. Students have told me, especially those who tend to get nervous when they take tests, all the way to very nervous, they tend to get to a test early and they sit there and study. So that's one mistake. And they also keep checking the clock. And they look at it like 30 minutes, 25 minutes, 20 minutes, and it's like the countdown to the electric chair. It starts to make them more and more nervous, which is not good. You're trying to minimize that as much as you can. So my suggestion to everybody always is to arrive 5 to 15 minutes early, and you may end up doing that normally in your classes, but as I said, especially on the day of a test, it's really important to do. Now, one of the things that I can tell you as a teacher, and having looked at a lot of student tests over the years, on average, people who are there at the beginning of a test score higher, a higher percentage pass a test than people who show up late. And this is true even if somebody's 1 minute late, or 5 minutes late, or 10 minutes late. It doesn't matter. They almost always score lower. And so one reason to get there a little early is so that you're there for the entire test and have all the time you need. That's kind of obvious. But there's another thing, and that is, a quick question for you about this is that if you arrive 5, 10, 15 minutes early and you're not going to sit there studying, what are you going to do for those last 5, 10, 15 minutes?
Relax. Breathe.
Yes, both of those sound good to me. Not take a nap or whatever, that's probably bad, but relax and breathe. I don't know when you take your tests in college whether you are totally calm all the way to really nervous. Everybody is different. But even if you're a little bit nervous, one of the things that's really good when you get there is to make sure you have your Scantron and your pencil or whatever you need, and then just sit there and close your eyes and take some deep breaths in and out. Most of the time when somebody's really nervous, their breathing changes, and they usually don't know that, but it does change. And what happens to the breathing when you get nervous? It gets... yeah, I always describe this like a dog panting, although hopefully you don't look like that, but it's like that, like short panting breaths. And that's what happens when you get really nervous. Well, if you show up for a test and you sit there and you think, I'm nervous or I'm not nervous, whatever you think, and you end up taking some deep breaths, and this is the way your breaths sound. And this happens to students all the time. I've had students say, I don't think I'm nervous, but maybe I am, let me try. And so they do this. And then they open their eyes and think, I think I need another one and another one. And so you get your breathing under control. It doesn't mean you're not going to be nervous, but it helps. Also, big benefit, every time you take a really deep breath, you're getting more oxygen to your brain. That's a good thing right before a test. It's like you're opening up everything that's in there. And so this is the main reason for it. And then wanted to show you one other thing, and then I'm going to give you the third strategy. Does anybody have a textbook in here that I can borrow for just a minute? Okay, well, a big one. Okay. All right. Every semester that I teach, here's what I see, especially the first test. I walk in to give the first test, take roll, 2 minutes to the test, and half the students are sitting there with their Scantron, and they're looking at me and just saying kind of like, okay, here we go. Other people frantically studying. Okay, so they have their book open or their notes, and they're looking at me and trying to cram all this information in at the last minute. And then finally, here's what I say. I say to everybody, okay, time for the test. You need to close everything up and put it off to the side or on the floor. So half the people who are doing this say, okay, and then they do it. But there's always at least 1, 2, 3 people who keep the book open, and they're still studying, and they're looking at me. And I finally say, okay, you need to close it up. And so this is what they do. Okay. And they say, okay, I'm ready. And I think what's going through their mind is, I'm the smartest person in this class because I used every minute of study time until the test. But my attitude about studying in those last minutes right before the test is the same one that I mentioned up here, and that is, unless you haven't studied at all, anything you see at the last minute in your book or notes is much more likely going to do something negative than positive, start to cause you to panic because you forgot something. Same example as before. So it's a lot better to just sit there, breathe, relax, etc. And then there's one other idea that may sound a little bit strange to you at first, but I always think this is a good idea too, especially in a big classroom. When you go in on the day of a test and you're there 5, 10, 15 minutes early, that means hardly anybody's there. So you have your choice of wherever to sit. Where should you sit? And I've had people say front, the back, the left, the right. You know, people say all kinds of ideas. Well, one little idea to throw out there is front is good on the day of a test, even if normally you sit somewhere else. And the main reason is this: who gets their test first, usually? People in the front. And if you're in a classroom, not like this, but that has, you know, rows of chairs, you've probably had the experience of being in the middle to back of a classroom, and the teacher counts out 10 copies, and then the person gives 9 behind them, and they take forever to get the test back there, and you're looking like this, and by the time you get it, the people in the front have already been working for maybe a minute or two. And I know it's just a minute or two, but it's a minute or two. You're trying to get every advantage you can. But the other suggestion, that the official one, is this. And that's sit alone. Be antisocial. Usually social's good. But in this case, sit alone. Why is that? Well, it's the same basic idea here, and that is to avoid distraction and to avoid confusion. So I'm going to give you 2 quick examples of this. In my first year of college, I made a huge mistake twice about 1 week apart. And then I learned, don't ever do that again. And I don't know if this has ever happened to anybody in here, but I walked into a classroom that was probably twice as big as this one, and I was about 10 or 15 minutes early, and hardly anybody was there. There were just a few students kind of sprinkled in the classroom, and I, for some reason, walked and sat right behind 2 students who were sitting together. And as I closed my eyes to breathe and all of that, like I said before, they started talking to each other. And what do people usually talk about right before a test? Yeah, they talk about how nervous they are, and they also talk about the test, you know, the information, right? Well, if I'm sitting there and they're like 3 feet in front of me and I'm closing my eyes trying to mind my own business, be in my own world, I can't help but hear everything they're saying. And the first time this happened, one person said to the other one something like this. I can't remember the name, but it was like this. Who was John Smith again? And my eyes were closed and I remember thinking, that's easy, I know that one. And the other person gave the wrong information about the wrong person. Oh, he's the one who did such and such, which was wrong. And I was thinking, oh, I don't want to hear anything wrong before a test. I'm just trying to keep the right information in my head. The second time this happened was about a week later, and this was even worse. I sat behind 2 people, different class, and they were talking to each other. And one person said something like this, who was Mary Roberts again? And I remember thinking, who? Who are you talking about? And the other person said, oh, she was the one who did this, and then after that she did this, and explained this long thing. And I opened my eyes and I said, excuse me. And they turned around and I said, who is that? We never learned anybody like that. They said, oh yeah, I was right there in chapter 2. The heart attack begins. I'm thinking, wait a minute, I didn't study that name at all. What other names didn't I study? And now I'm starting to panic. And here comes the teacher saying, you ready? And I'm thinking, no, I thought I was a couple minutes ago. Well, that's a horrible way to get started on a test, to be doubting yourself. So all of this is designed to have you be relaxed and in a good frame of mind when the test starts. Okay, one last thing about getting to a test late. When a student comes late to one of my tests, oftentimes, maybe let's say they're 5 minutes late, which doesn't sound like much. What they end up doing is this. Everybody's sitting there quietly taking the test, and they walk in like this. And I just look at them and I think, oh man, you are headed for disaster. When you are rushing, your heart pounds, your breathing goes faster and all that, the same things that happen when you're nervous. So if you're nervous and you're running late, forget it. And so you want to be there, and when the test is given to you, again, be in really good, focused frame of mind. It doesn't guarantee that you're going to get an A on every test you take, but if you don't do these things, you have a tendency to get off to a bad start. And when you get off to a bad start, it usually gets worse and worse after that. Okay, so these are 3 strategies. I'm going to give you 3 more next week when we're talking about more test-taking skills. Anybody have any question about this before we move ahead? Yes?
I took my algebra test, because right now I'm in Math 1A15, and I panicked at. I was trying to figure out the problems, how to do it.
Right.
And I thought it was going to come to me. It didn't come to me.
One of the things that I hate to do is sort of to put you off on this. One of the subjects that's covered in next week's workshop is sort of how to get your brain working again if you start to blank out or get nervous, because that happens all the time. And it's no big deal if it happens. You just need to have a plan for how to get it going again. And that's one of the things I'm going to explain next week, so you have to wait a week. But that happens all the time. So any other questions? Okay. That's good. That's good. We're going to talk about 2 test question types for the rest of the workshop today. The first one is true-false. And so I'm going to put you to work on something in a minute, but I wanted to introduce true-false this way. When I ask students this question, I usually get a weird look from them, but I say, out of all the different types of test questions, what's your favorite type? And most people say none. Right? But when they say a particular type, almost everybody, amazing numbers, say, oh, true, false. And I say, that's your favorite one? Why? And here's what they do. Their thumb comes out, I don't know what that is, and they say 50-50. That's their answer. It's like flip a coin, you know, multiple choice is 1 out of 4, 1 out of 5, true, false, oh, just 50-50, get the feeling and answer it. But true, false can actually be among the most confusing and tricky questions of all. And that's what I wanted to kind of show you and talk to you about for a little bit today. So I'm going to put you to work. This is a test-taking workshop. So what am I going to have you do? Yeah, take a test. And my attitude is that you can never take too many tests. And people look and say, yeah, you're a teacher, aren't you? Okay, this should be the most relaxing test you ever take in your life because, first of all, you're not going to turn it in. And it's not going to get graded. It's just to illustrate some things. Okay, and the other thing I'm going to tell you, 2 things. 10 true-false statements. I want you to read each one carefully a couple times and put T or F in the blank, right? Normal. But the one thing I wanted to tell you, just so that you understand this, is that the first 5 questions, the first half of this little test, has to do with board games and card games. And if you read a few of these, you may not even know what those games are. And so don't worry about it. Just look at it carefully and make your best guess. I'm not trying to test your knowledge of things, which is what usually happens on a test. The last 5 questions are about study skills. So everyone's kind of more, I guess, even on that one. So again, you don't have to put your name on this. You're not turning this into me, but I'm going to give you about maybe 3 minutes or so to work through these. And I don't want you to go really, really fast, but I don't want you to get stuck on one either. So just take a few minutes to do these, try to answer them the best you can, and then I'm going to use this as part of my teaching in just a couple minutes. Okay. Now, whether you got all those right, whether you missed half of them, doesn't really matter for this, but what I wanted to say first is to make sure everyone understands the most important thing about true-false, and that is when you read a true-false statement, how much of it needs to be true in order for you to mark true.
All of it. Well, all of it.
Yeah, all of it. And the reason for that, so 100%, that means that if you read a long true-false statement and 90% of it was right and one little part was wrong, it's false. It's got to all be right. So one of the worst things you could do as a test taker is to read a true-false statement kind of quickly. Okay, that's true. Okay, that's false, because it's easy to overlook one word or one part of a word that can make the whole thing false. So you actually want to slow way down when you read true false and look at every word and even look at it twice and make sure you see everything and then answer. Okay? Now, the second thing, which is the main point of this little quiz that I had you take, is this. It's always good to be on the lookout for specific words in true false that have a tendency to guide you as to whether something is more likely true or false. And so I want you to help me with these. We'll just kind of compile a list pretty quickly here. In statement number 1, what is the key word there?
Everyone.
Everyone. Okay, what does everyone mean?
100%.
Yeah, it means everyone. Okay, how many exceptions?
None.
None. Okay, when you see a word like that in a true-false statement, what is the answer usually going to be? It's usually going to be false. Always false? No, but usually, and that's because most things in life have at least one exception, and all you have to do is think of one exception, and it makes the whole thing false. And I'm going to show you a little more about that in a minute. How about number 2?
No one.
Right, no one. Okay, and no one means no one, no exceptions. It's the same exact idea as this, it's just on the other end. So whenever you see a word that has no exceptions to it, it's very extreme, then all you have to do is say, okay, that is a danger word. So if I can think of one exception, it's false. And if you can't think of any exceptions, mark true. But usually those are false. Okay, number 3, what's the word there? Right, frequently. And why is this word better in a true-false statement than those other ones?
Because it doesn't include everything.
Right, it's more kind of more reasonable. It's sort of like more in the middle. These are actually called in-between qualifiers, and these are 100% qualifiers. And so other words like most, some, few, we could write a long list of these. These might be in the middle, they might be leaning one way or another, but because they allow for exceptions, they're more often true. And again, it's not that these are always false, and it's not that these are always true, but you need to be on the lookout for them. Okay, number 4, I'm going to skip for a second. Number 5, the word there is mostly, and I can sort of stick a little ly on the end. And then number 6, there are 2 words there. What are the key words in number 6?
Should always.
One of them is always, and the other one is every. And again, this again allows for no exceptions, so that means that it is more likely to be false. But I did want to stop here for a second. A lot of people get number 6 wrong, and probably some of you missed that. And that's because teachers always tell you, don't leave anything blank. You know, even if you have to guess, answer everything, because if you leave it blank, you're going to get a 0. But remember, all it takes is one exception to make it false. Does anybody know any test you've ever taken or anybody ever takes where that's not true, that you should always answer every question? Scantron is possible. What I have in mind more is most of you at one point in your life took a standardized test like the SAT and other kinds of tests. And on those tests, they have the weirdest scoring ever. You never experienced this in college. You get a point if you get it right. You lose a fraction of a point if you get it wrong. And if you leave it blank, if you don't answer it at all, what happens? Nothing. They don't count it. Well, that's pretty rare, right? Usually if you leave it blank, it's automatically wrong, but all it takes is 1. So again, that's why you want to notice those words. Number 7, the word is some, which I have up here. Number 8, I'll skip for a second. How about 9 and 10? What are the words there?
Never.
Yeah, never and all. Okay, so again, these lists can be much longer. These are not the only words, but this idea of qualifiers, 100% qualifiers, in between qualifiers is very important to look out for. Okay, and then the other thing that I want to share with you about true false, and then we'll get to essays and other writing. That'll be our last topic today. Number 4 and number 8 we skipped, and that's because they deal with something different. If you got number 4 and number 8 right, either you were a lucky guesser or you knew what to do with them. Most people miss one, a lot of people miss both, and the reason is easy. If you look back at them, you can't even figure out what they're saying. They're very confusing the way they're worded. And the reason for that is because of this problem that comes up a lot in true-false, and that is double negatives. So that means when you see 2 words or parts of words that are in the negative in a statement, it makes your brain kind of twist like a pretzel, and it makes it hard to even figure out what's being asked. And so when you look at number 4, I want to encourage you to do something. Usually you can't do what I'm about to ask you to on the test because teachers don't usually want you to write on the test booklet. You just have to do it mentally, but you can do it physically because this is yours. I want you to cross out the 2 negatives in sentence number 4, and those are not and un, just the un part. Those are the 2 negatives. So if you take those out and you read what's left, it says Monopoly is a suitable game for children age 6 and under. And if you don't know much about Monopoly, that wouldn't help. But Monopoly is a pretty complicated game. Some adults can't even figure out how to play it. So it's not really good for very small children. That's why that's false. And number 8 is even more extreme than that. You could cross out the word not and the out part of without because that's the negative. And when you do that and you read what's left, it says a test may be with or have poorly worded questions. Is that true that a test may have poorly worded questions? Yes, like that one. And so that's why that's true. And when people see that, they think, why didn't they just say it that way? Then I would have gotten it right. I don't even know that's what they were asking. Again, it's confusing. So as I said, usually you can't do it physically by crossing out, but you can take words out, read what's left, and just see, does it make more sense now? This won't always work, like it won't solve the problem every time, but a lot of times it will. And once you take the negatives out and read what's left, you think, okay, now I know what it's asking, and hopefully you studied correctly, and as a result, you do well on that. Okay, so there's a lot more that I could explain about true-false, but these are, I think, some of the most important ideas. So we're going to spend the last part of the workshop talking about essays. And this is most people's least favorite kind of test. If you love writing, and every time you get an essay test you get excited, that's good, but you're kind of in the minority. Most people would rather fill in a bubble on a Scantron anytime rather than write. So I'm going to give you some ideas, and I have to tell you one really quick thing before we start this, and that is everything that I'm going to tell you in the next 10 to 15 minutes has nothing to do with English teachers. Okay, all of you have had English teachers before, and you know the way they are with your writing. They get out a magnifying glass and they find every little thing, and they're very picky about everything. And the reason they are is because they're trying to turn you into good writers. Okay, so that's their job. But most teachers, when you write for them in college, they have a different way of looking at it than English teachers do. And so the first thing that I wanted to tell you is this. I don't know if you're familiar with these terms or not, but this is always an important place for me to start when it comes to essay tests. There are two types of test questions that you get in your life, objective and subjective. Okay? Every question is one of those two. Some tests have both on them, depending. Well, objective, the best way to remember that is that any question that you can answer by filling in a bubble on a Scantron is considered an objective question. So that would normally be multiple choice, true, false, that kind of thing. Subjective is totally different, and the most common type is essay, although it can include any kind of written assignment or report or anything like that. And the reason that I think this is important to know is this. All of you have done Scantron tests before, and when you get your Scantron back, you see pink lines, hopefully not too many of them, but pink lines, right? And those are all the wrong answers. And then you see a score stamped on there. That's your score. It has nothing to do with the teacher's opinion, view, anything else. It's just whatever you get, you get. And that's why it's called objective. But subjective is totally different from that. It is up to the mood and the opinion of the teacher, and they're looking for certain things, but there are certain things students do all the time in writing that drive teachers crazy. And if you drive your teacher crazy, what happens to your grade? Yeah, it just starts, pretty soon it's circling the drain at the bottom. So if you know ahead of time what bothers a teacher, you'll try not to do it, and then hopefully that should help your grade to be better. So that's my job in the next several minutes, is to tell you some of the things that teachers really hate to see in writing, and then if you know those, you'll be careful to avoid them, and that's the whole point, okay? So the first thing is this. I want to ask you this from your own personal experience or just a guess. If you got an essay question on a test and then you had room to write on the front and the back or a blue book or anything else, what do you think most students do as soon as they read the essay question? What's the very next thing they do? Yeah, they start writing, which sounds like the right thing to do, but usually that's a huge mistake. They read the question and think, ooh, 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 and then they just, here we go, they start writing. But the problem with that is, unless you're the greatest writer in the world, what ends up usually happening is that you write about something and then you think, okay, that's about it about that. And then you go on to something else, and then halfway through that, oh, you remember something else about the first thing, and your paper starts turning into a mess. I always tell students this, if you're ever with a teacher and you're watching them, watching their face while they correct your writing, and you see them, they're on the second page, and you see them do this. Like that, you can just sit there going, there went my grade right down the tubes, because they're looking, thinking, wait a minute, he talked about that over there, and now he's talking about it again, and you're making the teacher work way too hard, okay? So a much better thing to do than this is this. You get the essay question from the teacher, and you're ready to go, and before you do anything, before you write any part of your answer, it's a really good idea for you to write a really short outline. And I don't mean Roman numerals and all, nothing complicated like that, but just maybe up in the corner of your paper somewhere, you can just number from like 1 to 3, and then jot down a phrase here and a phrase here and a phrase here. And what are these things that you're writing? Yeah, they're the main ideas, the topics that you want to make sure you include in your answer, okay? If you do that, if you spend like 30 seconds to a minute sort of planning, okay, these are my 3, and I'm going to do that one first, that one second, and then I'm going to finish with that one, then what you did is you took a minute to plan. And you've heard the saying, it's really good to think before you speak, and we'd all be in better shape if we remembered that. It's also good to think before you write. And so you take 1 minute doing this. Everybody else is just writing like crazy. But when you start writing, you write about your first topic, you write about the second one, you write about the third one, and then when you turn it in, even if your writing's not perfect, it's so easy for the teacher to follow. It's like you're guiding them through. And if you were a teacher and you were correcting a lot of papers and you had to try to figure one out, I think you'd have the same reaction. So if you just deliver it in a way that's very clear and organized, that really helps. And so just writing a brief outline can help a lot, especially if writing is not your greatest strength. Okay, the other things that I want to share with you over these last few minutes are on this handout, and I'm not going to be able to go through all of this. You can certainly take this with you and read through it a little bit more at a later time. I think there's a lot of good advice on here, but I just want to hit on about 3 or 4 things that I think are maybe the most important on here. The first one, when you look at the top of the page, is it says the most crucial task you have when preparing for and then taking an essay exam is to ask your teacher exactly what he or she wants you to include in your answer and how you're supposed to write it. And this is extremely important because essay tests are subjective, as I mentioned, and each teacher is unique in terms of what he or she wants to see and doesn't want to see on your paper. If every teacher had the exact same rules for writing, life would be a lot easier, but every teacher has different rules. And again, we're not talking so much about English teachers here. Okay, so here's what I want to show you. A couple of things. First of all, I have talked to a lot of teachers who are not English teachers but who have their students write, and I've asked them what bothers you the most about student writing. Number one is what I just explained here, writing that's just all over the place and not organized. But the second thing that drives teachers crazy, so this is good for you to know, has to do with number 1 under the general guidelines. It says read the question carefully and watch for instruction words. Okay, what are those? Well, turn over to the back and I want to show you some examples here. This is not a complete list. There are a lot more than this, but you see the words compare down to summarize, and you see the meaning for each one. Every essay question you ever get in your life is going to have one of these words in it or another word that means something similar. And what most students do, which lowers their grade every time, is they ignore that. Okay, so here's my example. Look at the second word on the list. It says contrast, and you see the meaning of that. Okay, here, imagine you're in an English class. It's a literature class. You've been reading stories and books all semester long, and you go in for your final exam, and here's the final exam. Teacher says, contrast this character from this book with this character from this book. So that's your essay. Well, if you're like most students, you ignore that word, and you write everything you know about that character, and everything you know about that character, you just throw it all on the paper, and then when the teacher reads it, they read it and they think, ooh, this is all good stuff, good stuff, good stuff. D or C or whatever. And why are they giving you a bad grade if everything you wrote was good? Because what did you do wrong? Yeah, you didn't follow the instruction. They didn't want the whole life story of those two characters. They wanted you to think of maybe 3 or 4 ways in which they were different and do that. So whenever a teacher uses one of these words, they're not just sort of throwing a word out there. They want you to answer it a specific way. So one of the smartest things you could do is before you've ever even done this, before you ever do your outline, read the question really carefully a couple times and ask yourself, where's the instruction word? And when you see it, think for a couple seconds and think, what exactly does that mean? And then try to answer it that way. And if you're able to do that, you usually can get a higher score because you're following a simple direction. Okay, back on the front side, I want to give you a couple of other ideas. Number 4 under the general guidelines says incorporate the question into your first sentence and briefly state your answer to the question. And so a lot of teachers really like this. If I give you an essay question that says, list and describe several reasons why you enjoy living in the Southern California area, okay, assuming you do. The way you start your answer is, I enjoy living in the Southern California area for several reasons, including the nice weather, the nearness to the beach and mountains, and the closeness to my family and relatives. So you repeat the question and you kind of give your answer. But if you do that, you gave it all away in the first sentence. What are you going to do for the whole rest of the essay? You kind of gave it all away. So what do you do? Write more. But what kind of writing do you do? Well, number 5. In the rest of your essay, develop the points that explain your answer and provide enough details to show that you know the material well. This is something that I always think is good news for everybody to know about. I've talked to teachers a lot and I've asked them, when you're reading a student paper and you're impressed, it's good. How do you decide whether to give the person an A or B? Because those are both, really good grades. And the answer almost every teacher gives me is the D word, which is details. If a teacher gives you B on something that you wrote, they're basically saying there's nothing big that you did wrong at all. It's strong, good paper. But how do you get from there to there? It's by slowing down and giving more details and examples, because that shows that you know more about the subject. And it's not just writing forever for the sake of writing, but it's giving more. When a person is really brief and quick and to the point, most teachers don't like that as much as someone who develops their points. And so I think this is good for you to know. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention is over on the back side on the bottom. And again, many things I could say here, but I just wanted to mention the bottom two, number 5 and 6. These are kind of favorites of mine to talk about. Number 5 says, is the writing mechanically, grammatically, and stylistically correct? What does that mean? Well, again, we're not talking about English teachers here. I've talked to some teachers and I say, what bothers you about student writing? And you know what some teachers say? First thing, besides what I said here, they say spelling. I hate spelling mistakes. Okay, that's just their own sort of pet peeve. Well, if you're not the greatest speller in the world and your teacher hates spelling mistakes, that's not a very good combination. And if you have to do writing in class, what should you do to solve the problem? Well, one of them is to ask the teacher, can I bring a dictionary to use when I'm taking it? If they say yes, then that solves the problem. But what if they say, no, closed book, closed all books? Then what do? And here's the answer. I know this sounds dumb, but it works. Only use words you know how to spell. Okay? So while you're writing and you're about to write a word and you're thinking, is that E-I or I-E? I don't have any, don't use it. You're just trying again to keep the teacher sort of in a good mood while they read your paper. And if you do things that just kind of jab at them, it tends to affect your score at least a little bit. And then the last part of this is number 6, is the writing at least fairly neat or legible? One of my skills as a teacher is I can read almost anything after all these years, but some students, I'm convinced, are training to be doctors. You know what doctors' writing looks like? No other human being can read that. And if you're at a point where you finish an essay and you have 5 minutes left, go back and reread it. And I know you can read your writing. I don't know how many other people can. It depends on how nice it is. But if you end up looking at a couple of words on there, and even you're thinking, what is that word? Try to fix them. And these are just minor things, but again, you're trying to deliver a paper in such a way that the teacher can very easily and comfortably read. They don't have to strain, and that tends to help your grade even a tiny bit, and you're looking for every advantage you can get. Okay, so lots more I could say, but you can read through the rest on your own, like I said, and I appreciate you coming today. Next week, multiple choice, test anxiety, kind of all of that we'll talk about, so I hope to see you then.